White Plow Horse in a Field of Hyacinths by the American expatriate painter George Hitchcock. The painting came back from the conservator's lab a couple months ago. It had been cleaned of its grime and darkened varnish and looked so much better. I don't know why it was never displayed at Belmont, certainly in my time, and I've been here 26 years, but I suppose a good reason is because it didn't have its own frame. And why it didn't have its own frame, we're not sure. George Hitchcock was the colleague of Gari Melchers, and this is Gari Melchers' home here. He and Gari both established a painting colony, an art colony in North Holland in the early 1880s. And so they were close friends, so it makes sense that there are a number of Hitchcock paintings in our collection. And this was one of them, but why no frame? Well, I have an idea. George Hitchcock was a little bit of a philanderer. And he left his wife in 1905, Henrietta, for one of his students, Cecil J. And married her, divorced his wife, and married Cecil J., who became a somewhat well-known painter in her own right. And as a result of him leaving his first wife, she was at times almost destitute. And Gari and Corinne Melchers, her good friends, often loaned her money. And I suspect it's quite possible that this was something she gave Gari and Corinne, maybe as collateral or just something to give in return for all the financial assistance they gave her over the years. And maybe it was just sitting in the house. George left it. He had never framed it. And so here it ends up at Belmont. And there's the painting. And it's a very unusual format, and maybe this is something that didn't work well for Hitchcock, and he left it with his first wife, and so it eventually came to Gari Melchers. And I think it's quite possible that it was never ever framed or on display by the Melchers while they lived here. But I love it, and it's a really good representation of the kind of painting that Hitchcock was doing in the 1890s. Hitchcock was trained and practiced as a lawyer in his native Providence, Rhode Island, until about the 1880s. He was still a relatively young man. He was born in the 1850s, died in 1913. But he chucked it all in the early 1880s and decided to go to Europe, like a lot of Americans, to become an artist. And he was really interested in watercolor originally, and so he went to Holland because there was a celebrated group of artists in the area of The Hague, and so they became known as loosely the Hague School. And he went there to learn from them. They were a celebrated group of watercolorists. And he liked it very much, but he knew he needed further training. He wanted to get into the South Kensington School in London, and he couldn't get in. So he went to Paris. He was able to enter a program at the Académie Julienne, and then he also went to Dusseldorf, and somewhere in either Paris or in Dusseldorf, Germany, at the academy there, he must have met Gari Melchers. But his training progress advanced, and so he ended up going back to Holland, and that's where he really began his work, painting pictures of traditionally costumed Dutch girls in tulip fields, and often girls posing as modern-day saints or biblical figures. Eventually, though, there was a shift in his art from these overt religious subjects to more secular subjects, and I think this was in his an attempt that he made in order to cater to the growing popularity of Impressionism. And collectors were becoming very interested in the bright colors, the bright colorization of Impressionism, the loose brushwork, the modern themes, atmospheric effects, and we see that in this painting of the White Plow Horse in the Field of Hyacinths. It's a modern subject. There's no religious symbolism in this picture. The colors are very bright and impressionistic, and we have a very clear sense of the heavy, humid atmosphere of northern Holland. And so this is the kind of painting he began to produce. He eventually became he was called the painter of sunlight because of his fondness for painting people out of doors in brightly lit landscapes, sunlit landscapes, and always with these bands of color representing the tulip fields and the hyacinths. This was always something that enlivened his paintings, and so it became a very popular subject of his. So here we are with a white plow horse in the Field of Hyacinths, all cleaned up. You hardly notice the farmer who's pretty much hidden by his giant plow horse. He did a variation of this, earlier variation. This is later, remember, when he began to shift toward more modern contemporary themes. The earlier version pictured a knight of old, on horseback, cutting through the tulip fields, and he looks very unhappy, in abject defeat. The banner that he carries as a knight in the Crusades is dragging behind the horse and the knight, and really pulling up all the tulips as he moves through the field. It's a very odd but very symbolic, typical early George Hitchcock. I'm not sure what the picture called Vanquish, the earlier symbolic version of this secular painting, what it symbolized, because you don't expect to see a crusader coming home in defeat, and you certainly don't expect to see a crusader coming home in Holland. But perhaps some of the religious crusaders came from as far away as Holland to fight in the Near East. All right, we are now going to load the painting onto a cart and take them upstairs to put them on display in the gallery. Putting our newly framed George Hitchcock white plow horse in the Field of Hyacinths on display for the first time ever at Belmont in a very pretty period style frame. We don't know exactly what frame Hitchcock would have wished to be on this painting, but we can guess based on the frames on his other paintings, and this is certainly a typical frame for the paintings of this period. This painting dates to about 1892. So it's later on in Hitchcock's period in Holland. He would die in Holland on his houseboat in the little village on the Zuiderzee called Marken. And I think his boat was called the Tulip. Kind of he became rather obscure in later years, but he's very well known today and very well liked because of his penchant for impressionist color and brush. So, if you want to see a beautiful picture, unusual picture, come to Belmont. I'm Joanna Catherine, I'm the curator, and I invite you to come up and see us, especially during the holiday season. It's a beautiful place during the holidays. Come and enjoy.